Very happy to welcome on Chrysta Castaneda. She is a candidate for the Texas Railroad Commission, and she's also an oil and gas attorney and engineer, as we need to talk about something that's been in the news today and yesterday. What is going on with all these oil prices? So just going through that background, Chrysta is certainly a qualified source to have on the show to talk about that, and Chrysta joins us now. Hey, how you doing today? Glad you could join us.
I'm glad to be with you.
So certainly a very volatile time in the oil markets as we saw those prices actually go negative yesterday. So can you talk about what exactly that means? Because I'm assuming that doesn't mean we're going to be getting paid to fill up our trucks, correct? Trucks and cars and everything, right?
Oh, if only that were true.
Yes.
But no, what it means is we are about to completely oversupplied with oil to where every barge, every ship, every pipeline is filled and there's no place to put it, and that oil producers have to pay people to take the product away if they're continuing to deliver it into the market. That's what these negative prices mean. And it is a super disastrous state for, really it's going to be for all of us. In Texas, 20% of our state revenues come from our oil economy. And so hundreds of thousands of jobs are going to be shed, and companies are shutting down. And while it seems like it's great to pay $1.50 for a gallon of gas right now, when people no longer have a supply, 6 months or 9 months from now, we're going to have a real challenge in that gas will go to $4 and $5 a gallon. So what we need is a functioning railroad commission, which is our state regulator, to help smooth out these oil price issues.
Yeah, because I was going to say, why should consumers care about this? Because as they look at what's happening right now, especially up where we are in Minnesota, we see gas prices in some areas approaching $1. But as you're talking about, this is really more of a short-term versus a long-term outlook, since you're saying, well, eventually, yeah, we might be seeing some low prices right now. Eventually, if we don't increase our supply, we could run into that situation where then all of a sudden we have those retail prices spike in 6 months or 7 months or even a little bit later than that.
Exactly, and I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when we all stood in line for gas because there was such a shortage. We don't want that. We do need functioning government. It's amazing in how many places we need functioning government right now. And when governmental institutions fail to act and be proactive about what we need, such as in the pandemic situation with testing and screening and all of that, and in this case with the failure to stabilize the oil market, we all suffer. We all suffer.
So the office you're running for in Texas is called the Railroad Commission, and you alluded to the fact that they largely regulate the oil and gas industry in Texas, which, as I'm sure everyone is aware of, is a very big industry, not just in Texas, but the entire country in terms of domestic oil. So can you talk about what exactly the Railroad Commission does, and then the thing they're doing today, because it sounded like they were considering cutting production for the first time in what it looked like 50 years, but they may have decided to punt on that situation and look at it down the road. So I know kind of a lot to unpack there, but can you talk a little bit about the Railroad Commission, what they do, and what they were deciding today?
Sure. So the Railroad Commission of Texas was the first OPEC. 100 years ago, it was given the ability to control production and thereby stabilize the oil market, and it used its powers many times during the Great Depression. It's interesting, the historic parallels. What the Railroad Commission does on an everyday basis is it sets the safety standards and the environmental standards for the production of oil and gas in the state of Texas. But it does have the power to regulate the oil markets, or at least the production side for the wells that are in Texas. And of course, Texas is a huge oil-producing state, so it does have a market impact. The Railroad Commission has a tremendous impact on our environment and on our prices at the pump and a whole lot of other things.
And let's talk about this meeting they had today, because they were considering cutting production for what would have been the first time since like the 1970s. And what did they ultimately decide? As I was trying to follow along on some social media accounts, it looks like they didn't quite make a decision on this. They just essentially decided to kick the can down the road and maybe decide on this later.
Yes, there was an astounding quote by one of the commissioners that was and I'm paraphrasing, but it was, well, we're deciding not to act, but don't accuse us of inaction. I don't know what that means, but the gist of it is that they don't know what to do. Because it has been 30 years or more since they actually used their regulatory powers in this fashion, they don't know how to do it anymore. And so they're going to, I guess, go on a more of a fact-finding tour for a longer period of time to figure out what it is that they should be done. And frankly, I just hope it's not too late. It would have been much better to be proactive about this, but they haven't done anything. They haven't refused to do anything, but what they do and whether they do it is weeks, if not months, down the road.
So I'll just put it this way. To me, it sounds like they're just going to kick the can down the road and hope the market conditions improve in a few months so they eventually don't have to make that decision, which is a little dangerous just to sit there and try to be hopeful that things improve. But I'm assuming you're in the camp where you would have liked them to take some sort of action today, correct?
Yeah, so I'm on the record as saying that they should have not mothballed the regulatory machinery. They should have continued to go through the analysis that was required on a month-by-month, quarter-by-quarter basis all this time, so that when we needed to put that safety mechanism in place, which is now, it was ready to go. It'd be a little bit like, somebody, washing windows on the side of a high-rise and deciding, I'm not going to wear my safety harness until I need it, which is right when I fall off the side. It just doesn't work that way.
And we're speaking with Chrysta Castaneda. She is a oil and gas attorney and also an engineer, and is running for the Texas Railroad Commission, which basically, as we've been talking about, regulates oil and gas production in Texas, because this is a significant topic with what happened yesterday with crude oil prices going negative. And as we were alluding to, that, while those retail gas prices might be good in the short term, it could have a massive long-term impact where those could end up spiking if our supply eventually does run out. So I want to continue on talking about this and kind of go to some basics in terms of how crude oil prices work and retail oil prices work. What's the relationship between those two? Because it's always kind of complicated to look and try to determine how gas prices are actually determined at the pump. Can you talk about that aspect a little bit?
Yeah, and it is complicated, and generally speaking, the price that you pay at the pump does bear a relationship to the price of a barrel of oil produced in the field. But it's not a direct relationship. There are all kinds of refining costs and delivery and production and transportation costs that are baked into the price of gasoline, along with, the transportation tax, the gas tax that funds our, national highway system and some state highway systems as well. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. You can't say that just because oil futures went negative, that we should all be paid to go fill up our tanks. It doesn't work that way, but it does, generally speaking, the price that you pay at the pump does bear some relationship to the availability of oil and the price of a barrel of oil.
Couple more questions for you here, Chrysta, before we have to wrap things up. So what are you expecting to see in the next few weeks and months with these oil prices? Because, as we've been talking about, a large part of this is that, the oil we currently have, we don't have a place to store it, and that's led to this huge drop in prices. What are you expecting to see in the coming weeks and months?
A lot of it is going to depend on how the pandemic plays out. How do we respond to the remaining challenges? Are we able to socially distance ourselves and protect ourselves enough while still returning to our jobs? When do people feel like it's safe to get on an airplane again? And are they willing to spend 9 or 10 hours flying to Europe. All of those things impact the demand for oil, but there are many who are saying that we've already hit peak demand for oil, and this has just further facilitated the switch to cleaner energy like solar and wind. We're not going to get rid of oil completely. Still transportation runs heavily on oil and will continue to do so for, another 10 or 15 years. But have we all switched our own personal habits in a way that may have a lasting impact on oil demand? Very likely so.
Yeah, certainly can't disagree with you there. And final question for you in terms of what we've been seeing with these domestic oil prices. Are we seeing any impact on these from what's been happening with the Russia-Saudi oil war, or I guess the truce they're into right now? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, and yes, that is a contributing factor to this problem. I mean, we've got the twin threats of COVID-19 decreasing, all of our demand for oil, and the Saudis did it at that just opened up the taps. I mean, it could be that what they foresee is that the value of the oil that they keep in the ground eventually goes to zero, and therefore they're just trying to sell as much of it as they can for as whatever they can get for it, because their economies are also heavily oil dependent. Saudi Arabia even more so. So that's that. I think the fact that they decided to flood the market is indicative of where they see oil going long term, which is very low oil prices.
Yeah, certainly going to be an interesting time we see over the next few months with what's happening with the pandemic, and also what you're talking about with the fact that, well, we may have already reached our peak demand in terms of oil. Unfortunately, we are up against the clock, though, but we've been speaking with Chrysta Castaneda. She is a candidate for the Texas Railroad Commission, which, again, is a commission that largely governs the oil and gas industry in Texas, which, as you can imagine, has a pretty big impact on the economy, not just in Texas, but around the entire country. Chrysta is also a gas and oil attorney and an engineer. And Chrysta, really appreciate the time today on the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.
Absolutely.